The space that Palestinians are living in is shrinking. So the idea is confine the Palestinians into as small a space as possible, take as much land as possible.
Diana Boutou is a Palestinian human rights lawyer, former Birzeit University professor, and former legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiation team. Boutou received her law degree from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, in Canada, and a Master's of Law from Stanford University. She is currently working as a lawyer on land confiscation, home demolitions, and revocation of residency. Boutou has appeared on numerous news and analysis programs speaking on refugee rights. The following presentation, given at the 2010 convention of Al-Auda, the Palestine Right to Return Coalition, is entitled Palestinian Refugee Rights, the Palestinian Political Process, and the So-Called Negotiations.
I know that for a lot of people with the Obama administration, with the new changing circumstances in the West Bank, that people actually believe that there is something different that is going around, that's going to happen this time around. And what I want to talk about today is how it's really nothing different that's happening this time around, and instead show through a series of slides why it is that nothing different is happening this time around. After the negotiations process ended in the year 2000, and currently, as we're hearing more and more talk of new negotiations, I think it becomes important to step back and ask ourselves, why is it that the negotiations failed? And you'll see a lot of commentary on the question of why it is that the negotiations failed. In my view, the negotiations didn't fail at all. It was quite the opposite. The negotiations very much succeeded. They succeeded in allowing Israel to implement its long-term strategy against the Palestinians. So don't mistake me. The negotiations did not fail from the viewpoint of Israel. They actually succeeded because it ended up being yet another tool that Israel uses in its long-term strategy of trying to confine the Palestinians into as small of a space as possible, take as much of their land as possible, while all the while pretending that there are sort of talks and a partner and negotiations, and if only, and if only, and if only. So really, at the essence, the negotiations process, again, don't misquote me, the negotiations process did not fail from the standpoint of the Israelis. It was a process that was put into place and designed precisely to carry out and implement Israel's long-term strategy. When the process began, Israel had declared that it had wanted a few things out of the so-called peace process. It wanted better diplomatic relations, it wanted better security, and it got both of them. But the thing that it ended up getting, which was even more important to Israel of better diplomatic relations and better security, was the continued land grab. And it's that continued land grab that I'm going to talk a little bit about now. So the first slide that we're looking at, and most of these slides are going to focus on the West Bank and then the Gaza Strip, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the Palestinians, like myself, who are citizens of the State of Israel. This first slide that you're going to see is, just a very typical slide of the West Bank with all of the cities that are demarcated on it. And here you've got your very typical Palestinian areas of Palestinian built-up areas sort of showing up on the map, the population and figures and so on and so forth. And here you've got the Israeli settlements that are showing up. Now, yesterday when Norman Finkelstein was talking, he mentioned something that was very important. He said the settlements themselves only comprise about 1% to 2% of the West Bank. He's actually right on that. He's actually factually right on this particular point. But you can see that the way that the settlements were built and have been built and continue to be built, it's not so easy, as Norman Finkelstein said yesterday, to simply just evacuate out 80% of the settlers and put them to 60% of the settlements. And here we've got the Israeli closed areas and military bases. Now, this particular slide I always feel is very important for one reason, which is It doesn't have any of the closures marked on it. It doesn't have any of the checkpoints that are marked on it. It doesn't have any of the roads that are marked on it. Anything like that. Nothing on that. But yet, anybody who even has a little bit of a sense of economy and how economies move, just looking at that alone, you can see that the solution that is being pushed forward, that of an economic solution, is one that's simply not going to work. It never will work. It never has worked, never will work. That even when you have the removal of checkpoints, which is what a lot of the members of the Palestinian Authority are now calling for, even when you do that, even if you simply remove all of the checkpoints, you're still faced with a situation like this, in which the vast majority of the West Bank is no longer in Palestinian hands or in Palestinian control. All right, so here we go to Oslo. And this is what happened during Oslo. This is the big prize that Israel wanted, is it wanted to be able to justify its separation of the people from their land. And so the way that they did it is very simple. You classify areas into Palestinian areas and Israeli areas, with Area A and Area B, those two areas that are highlighted there, being the so-called Palestinian areas where you have a pseudo-Palestinian government coming to pseudo-control the pseudo area. And then you create the parity, so that just as there's a Israeli government, there's also a Palestinian government. Just as there's an Israeli prime minister, there's a Palestinian prime minister. Just as there is an Israeli president, there's a Palestinian president. Unfortunately, when it comes to Palestinians, we actually have two prime ministers, one president. We had a coup without really having a state. And, you know, the rest is history, so to speak. Anyway, so the point of it was trying to separate Palestinians from their land. And you can see very clearly that this was the beginning bases of how to separate people from their land. You do it ethnically. You try to separate ethnically. Add to that the settlements. Now, the interesting thing about the settlements was that during the period of the Oslo process, a time when, as I said, one of the goals that the Palestinian Authority, or the PLO, had at the time was to create statehood and to focus on statehood and to move away from the issue of the right of return. Instead, give compromise rights for something like this. So compromise the issue of the right of return in order to get statehood. And the fascinating thing with all this, and this is the part that is never really clicked for me, is that even during the period of negotiations, even during the period where they were focused exclusively on this concept of statehood and on getting a state, that even during this period, the number of settlements ended up doubling during the period of the year from 1993 to the year 2000. They ended up doubling from 200,000 settlers to 400,000 settlers within a 7-year period. It was as though the Oslo Accords gave Israel the green light and they pushed it and they said, we're going to go ahead and we're going to continue to build and continue to build and continue to build, and nobody is going to stop us. And indeed they did. So now what you're looking at is you've got a situation in which there are close to 500,000 settlers that are now living in the West Bank. Living in a situation of more than apartheid, in which they control the vast majority of the land. You then have, after you put on the settlements, you then got a situation. You've then got the closed military areas and the closed military zones, and you can see how, during the period of Oslo, and this is current day, these are current day maps, by the way, that the space that Palestinians are living in is shrinking. So the idea is confine the Palestinians into as small a space as possible, take as much land as possible. So again, the tools are home demolitions, land confiscation, so on and so forth. But it's that ideology that hasn't gone away, and it's that ideology that we need to be challenging. Another tool that's used to confiscate land, nature reserves. And this is what we're looking at right now. So the point of all of this is that during the period of Oslo, during the period of the negotiations, that Israel's long-term strategy has been and always will be to try to get rid of as many Palestinians as possible, whether it's by getting rid of them, turning them into refugees, or by confining them into as small of a space and taking up their land. This is the long-term strategy, and this is the strategy that we need to be fighting. Now, here's, I love this slide because it actually shows you what's actually happening. It's when you do something close up. And what you're looking at here is you've got this is actually satellite imagery, where the white line there that you see there, that's actually the wall, which you can actually see from above through satellite imagery. What you're looking at first is you're looking at the city of Qalqilia, which is the city that's this round sort of bulbous city to your left. And this is where the wall has gone up. Okay, there's the Palestinian population. Again, the strategy is playing itself out. Confine the Palestinians into as small a space as possible, take as much land. 2 Israeli settlements in the area, combined settler population of maybe 7,000. You've got a Palestinian population of about 50,000 Palestinians. And you can see the fascinating thing is that here I was part of the team that worked on litigating the case of the wall before the International Court of Justice. And this was one of the slides that we actually ended up using, which is it shows you very clearly the link between what Israel's long-term strategy is and how it is that it's affecting that long-term strategy. So you see in this slide, you've got the 2 settlements that are outside of the wall, and you've got the Palestinian population, which is actually confined and separated inside that wall. Now, again, this is the part where I often kind of wonder about Israeli statements. You can see that the wall goes around not just the settlement itself, but also around the planned expansion area of that settlement, with the long-term goal, again, being confine the Palestinians into as small a space as possible and take as much land as possible. I think that the major issue that I wanted to focus on here is that this time around, the difference is going to be absolutely zero. With one exception, which is what they actually call the talks. Between the period of 1993 to 2000, they called them negotiations. This time around, they're calling it proximity talks. I don't really know what a proximity talk is. Like, it just means that one person is close to the other and they're not really talking. There's a mediator. I'm not really quite sure what that whole thing means. But the same problem is going to happen that happened during the period of 1993 to the year 2000, which is a problem that I faced during that period, which was that between the period of 1993 to the year 2000, I, for one, and I can't speak about anybody else, but I, for one, checked out. And the reason that I checked out was that I was reading the New York Times, and I was reading the Washington Post, and I was reading the Wall Street Journal. And what was important to me at the time between those years was finishing law school and becoming a lawyer. I don't know why that was so important to me, but it was. And so what mattered to me when I read the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and the New York Times was seeing whether there was a handshake, whether there was a meeting. It didn't really matter to me what was coming out of the meeting, but I felt that things were good. I felt that things were moving in the right direction. This time around, we're going to continue to see the same reporting. It's going to be a little bit different. It's going to continue to be like, did he wink or did he blink? Did he nudge or did he elbow? Did he whatever? Was he sending a message? Is he not sending a message? But that's going to be the only difference, is that in terms of the substance is going to continue to be the same, which is that, first, on the issue of land, Israel has never and will never recognize or acknowledge the Palestinian right to exist in their homeland. It has never happened. It will never happen unless we do something about it, which I'll talk about in a second. The second thing is that, somewhat similar to what Norman Finkelstein said yesterday, is that there's going to continue to be demands on Palestinians to even concede even further on their own territory, something that we've seen in the past and will continue to see in the future. So even if you are somebody who believes in the two-state solution, ideologically believes in the two-state solution, the two-state solution, as they would like to put it, is not going to be one that is based on the 1967 borders or even based on the 1947 partition plan, but instead is going to be based on something that is practical and something that's doable and something that we can this and we can that. With the idea being that as Israel continues to negotiate and puts a gun to the head of the Palestinians, they're going to continue to demand more and more and more concessions from the Palestinians, saying that unless you actually accept and make these huge concessions, we are not going to stop the human rights abuses and the atrocities that we're committing in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, and indeed to the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel and to refugees. That's the next thing. The third thing is Jerusalem. One of the most fascinating things that's happened with Jerusalem is that as the peace process continued, and as now the so-called proximity talks are about to launch, half of all of the land confiscation orders that we're now receiving in the West Bank, about half of them are actually in the area of East Jerusalem. More than half of the home demolition orders that are taking place now in the West Bank, in Area C, and in other parts of the West Bank, more than half of them are now coming from the area of Jerusalem, of East Jerusalem. In terms of the issue of building, fewer than 128 permits were issued last year to Palestinians living in East Jerusalem to be able to build their homes. This is a crime. When you hear of a population that is 200,000 strong and growing, to only get 128 permits, housing construction permits, during that year, at the same time when West Jerusalem got more than 8,000 construction permits. It shows you what the long-term strategy is. And do these, and again, the point is really confine and try to get rid of as many Palestinians as possible. Confine them, make life so difficult that they eventually leave. And that policy is not going to change. And finally, and I think the most important thing when it comes to the negotiations, is that there has never been, and there will never be, provided that the current configuration is in place, any recognition that Palestinians have a right to return to their homes, period. This is something on the part of Israel. Unfortunately, that same issue is also taking place within the PLO and within the Palestinian Authority. If you read carefully, and words are very, very careful, if you read very carefully, what you see in every single peace plan, if they want to call it that, every peace plan that has been put forward on the table over the course of the past decade pretty much takes the same shape and form. Oh, you know, some sort of a compromise on territory so that you get somewhat of the 67 borders, somewhat of a compromise so that there's a land swap, somewhat of a compromise when it comes to East Jerusalem. But the fascinating thing, and this is something that the so-called Palestinian leadership and the negotiators are saying, and this is why words are important, is they're not talking about the right of return. Instead, they talk about things called just solutions. Solution does not equal rights. And this is the most important thing that I think we need to be aware of. Now, all of this is to say that when it comes to the issue of negotiations, again, to many of us, the negotiations failed. But we shouldn't be viewing it as a failure of the negotiations, but we should be viewing it as a success of Israel's project in order to try to put forward and promote negotiations. And this is why it becomes very alarming when we ourselves begin to use the language of negotiations and begin to believe in the process of negotiations. The process of negotiations is a process that has been very successful. It's been very, very successful for Israel. Now, with that, I want to talk just for a few seconds about how it is that we move forward and what it is that we collectively can do. Not only was my father displaced in 1948, but he didn't just flee to Nazareth in 1948. They actually have quite an interesting story, which will relate to what I want to talk about now, which is that in 1948, my grandmother and grandfather fled, along with, at the time, they had 9 children. They ended up doubling that by 9 years later. So it ended up being a very, very large family that I come from. But in 1948, they fled. And they fled not just from El Mjadel to Nazareth, but they then fled from Nazareth up to Lebanon. And then from Lebanon, they went to Syria. And from Syria, they went to Jordan. And then from Jordan, they became infiltrators, just like there's now this new law of infiltration. It's very interesting how history repeats itself. So they infiltrated back, so-called infiltrated back in 1950. My grandmother recently passed away, and which was very hard and very emotional for me. But just before she passed away, I had a really wonderful opportunity. She died at the age of 97. She was grandmother to, I think it's 73 children, great-grandmother to 198, and great-great-grandmother to 13. So she was a remarkable, remarkable woman. But one of the things that she ended up saying to me before she passed away, she was a very feisty woman, was I asked her, I said, you know, Grandma, why did you flee in 1948? And these are the stories I think are very important because we never have this conversation as families. We never really talk to one another about what's happened in history and why and what they were thinking, what her dreams were and what have you and so on. And I had the opportunity, I asked her, so why did you flee in 1948? And she said, we didn't flee. I was like, well, what do you mean you didn't flee? She said, we were waiting for the Iraqi army. Okay. Jaish al-Fawzi. Waiting for the Iraqi army. Now, anybody who's read history, they know that they sort of stopped at the West Bank just in order to protect their little protectorate and what have you. But this was what she was told, is that they were not fleeing, they were just going to be leaving because they were waiting for the Iraqi army. And they waited for the Iraqi army for a period of about 2 years. And in 1950, when she decided, and she was the one who decided, it wasn't my grandfather, it was her, she was the one who decided. 1950, she decided that she was going to go back. And she was going to go back to Palestine. They didn't know that Al-Mujadala had been taken over at this point in time. When she decided to go back, I asked her, I said, well, why did you decide to go back? And she said a very important thing, which has stayed with me forever, which is, I realized that the Iraqi army was not coming. Okay. And so this is the point, is that we have been waiting for far too long for the Iraqi army to show up. We've been waiting. We put our faith in a leadership that has proven that it cannot lead. We've put our faith in a leadership that has proven that it is corrupt and that it's more interested in maintaining the trappings of power and continuing to implement Israeli strategy. We've put our faith in the U.S. administration, believing that somehow, if only Americans knew a little bit more about us, that they will somehow change, and that the U.S. administration will change, and that U.S. policy will change. We've been waiting for the Iraqi army for far too long. And it's time for us to now no longer wait for the Iraqi army. And it's time for us to actually start doing things just in the same way that my grandmother in 1950 decided, despite everything, with at that point in time now 11 children, no longer 9, to go back to Palestine. She was no longer going to wait for the Iraqi army. And this is what it's now our duty to do this as well. We cannot wait for the Iraqi army any longer. We have to take matters into our own hands. So the question becomes, what is it that we do? There's a few things that I think that we need to focus on. First is we need to focus on the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. We need to focus on this. Yes, thank you. We need to focus on BDS for, and I don't want people to say, oh, it's not going to do anything, it won't work, it won't this, it doesn't. It will work. It will work. It will work. And even if it doesn't work, at least we tried. And it will work. It will work. Now, the reason we need to focus on boycott, divestment, sanctions, and I know I'm speaking to an audience of people who are sympathetic, is that for far too long, Israel's just gotten away with matters. They've gotten away with murder. Literally, they've gotten away with murder. And the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is the only thing that is going to try to put a stop to Israel in terms of not being able to get away with murder any longer. The second thing, and I think this is also a very important thing, is we need to start focusing on our ability, and Palestinian ability, to stay in Palestine. If you believe that the long-term strategy of Israel is to try to get rid of as many Palestinians as possible and take as much land of theirs as possible, then the only response that you can have to that is to make sure that Palestinians actually remain in their land. That's it. So what I mean by that is there are a lot of projects that focus on Sumud. These are the projects that we need to start focusing on now. These are the projects where we need to start. Palestinians don't need more ambulances. Really, they don't. What we need strategies that ensure that Palestinians actually remain on their land, on the ground. That's the second thing. And with that, I think that it becomes crucially important that we stop focusing on the divisions that are taking place within our own community. And there are plenty of divisions that are within our own community. I don't care about Hamas. I don't care about Fatah. I don't care about all of the petty politics. To me, it goes back to something that Mustafa actually once said, which is all of this is a group of bald men fighting over a comb, really. And that's what it is. So it doesn't matter to me who's in charge or why they're in charge, but what matters to me is whether any of these organizations have as their primary goal making sure that Palestinians remain on their land. And the third, and I think one of the next strategy that I think we need to start employing is that something that Jess referred to, Jess spoke about yesterday, which is holding people accountable and trying to make sure that Israeli leaders get held accountable. One of the most fascinating things that has happened as a result of the Gaza massacre is that Israelis can no longer travel. They are afraid to travel. The Israeli leaders are afraid to go to the UK. They're afraid to go to other countries within Europe. And it's a growing movement now that I want to continue to see, which is I want to make sure that it's not just Israeli leaders that are held to account, but that it is the Israeli people that are now held to account. I don't like this fiction of separating the people from the leadership, because I personally believe that the only way that people will be held accountable is if the actual people are now beginning to be held accountable for the actions of the government. That's one of the next things. In addition to that, I also believe that there's a lot of legal strategies that we can be employing on this matter. I'm not a lawyer who believes that law is just sort of developed out of a vacuum. I really understand the power dynamics that go into development of law. But I think that as a whole, we're a growing community. We're getting stronger. We're getting louder. 10 years ago, there weren't this many people in the room. In 2 more years' time, this room will be double the size it is. It will be double the size that it is. And so because of that, our voices are becoming louder, they're becoming stronger, and we need to start focusing on other mechanisms to ensure al-awda. The final thing that I think is one of the most important strategies that we need to focus on is that if you look at one of the elements that has divided us as a community, and I'm not talking about factionally, but I'm talking about as a community, has been this debate of two-state, one-state, Hamas, Fatah, so on and so forth. I think that we're wrongly placed, we are misplaced at focusing on that as being the primary dividing point. That is not, to me, the primary dividing point. The primary issue for me is, do you believe that Palestinians have the right to return? That's it. Do you believe that Palestinians have the right to live in their homeland? That's it. It doesn't matter to me, and it's never been I've never been a person who's believed that statehood or the concept of statehood, whether it's 2 states or 1, will be something that actually enshrines people's human rights. It never has in the history of mankind. It never will in the history of mankind. States are actually oppressors of human rights. They are not elements that uphold human rights. Instead, we need to start focusing on the concept of al-awda. And if we focus on the concept of al-awda as a community, I think that we will be able to overcome this long-term strategy that Israel has, whether it's a strategy that Israel has, whether it's a strategy that the Palestinian Authority has bought into, or whether it's a strategy that has been used to divide us as a community. We need to start focusing on our unity, and our unity is al-awda. So with that, I want to thank you very much, and I'm open for questions. Thank you.